Hello, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast, where we talk to world-leading experts about how to unlock the full potential of people who work in high-stress, high-stakes environments. I'm John Paul Nevin.
And I'm Martin Jones. And in this episode, we're talking to Professor Greg Haff about the often misunderstood concept of periodization.
I often think of it as an operational plan. It's basically what I'm trying to accomplish and how I think I'm going to get there.
We explore the importance of managing both fitness and fatigue.
Fatigue masks your fitness gain. But the beauty is fatigue will dissipate at a 2/3 rate faster than fitness. So if I organize my training correctly, I manage fatigue and elevate fitness. Thus, my performance goes up.
The need to understand both physical and psychological requirements.
The rate of recovery is actually impacted by psycho-emotional stress. So if someone's under high psycho-emotional stress, their sense of fatigue is greater. Their time course of recovery is greater.
And the problems that can arise if periodization isn't properly incorporated into training programs.
We have the risk of mismanaging loads, which then increases the risk of injury, which decreases potential for operational readiness.
Greg, welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about you guys?
Good, mate. Really good. Stoked to have you on board for this one. Can you just give us an insight into your backstory, what it is you specialise in and how you've came into this particular area?
My journey into sports science / strength and conditioning / tactical science, I guess now has been kind of a strange journey. I've always been into sport mainly because my father is a Marine. Physical training was just part of life. It's just what we did. And I found that I really quite enjoyed strength training and I enjoyed being in the strength training environment. And when I got to university, a professor named Frank Pulo came in one day when I was training. He was like, you should study sports science. And he handed me a copy of Boyd Epley's Husker Power book and introduced me to the NSCA. At the time, it was 1988. So NSCA was only a year old. In 89, York Barbell talent ID'd me for weightlifting. And so I kind of went down the weightlifting path. I never intended to get a PhD. Actually, I had made my father a promise that I would join the Marine Corps after I got my master's degree and gave the Olympics a run. But sadly, I ruptured the long head of my bicep and I can't pass the pull-up test. So my father was quite upset with me at the time. And then in 2007, I think it was, I was on the board of directors for NSCA, and a guy named Mark Stevenson, who's quite famous in the tactical population space, walked in the room and he's like, I want to start this program called Tactical Strength and Conditioning and I need money from the NSCA. So we got Mark the money and then Tactical Strength and Conditioning was born in the United States.
So Greg, obviously you are an absolute legend in the field of periodization. And I think back to when I was moving into the world of professional S&C, I came across one of your early papers on periodization.
Yep.
And that's what, 21 years ago?
Long time ago.
Yeah. And I still use those as core articles for the undergraduate program and indeed the MSc program which we run, because they just set the scene so well. But obviously, you've developed a bit since then. You recently published the book, Periodization, which is a pretty authoritative text. But I suppose for listeners, it'd be really useful to give them a definition as to what is periodization and why is it important?
It's actually a phenomenal question because right now, I think we are quite confused about what periodization is. And we're conflating programming and periodization a lot in the scientific literature, but also in the applied literature. So the way I often think of it as an operational plan, it's basically what I'm trying to accomplish and how I think I'm going to get there. But I'm going to have the flexibility under that operational plan to change the modes and means to get there. And so from that perspective, I'm setting out what am I trying to accomplish? Where am I trying to go? What am I trying to do? And setting some timeframes to them. And I can do that in different ways for different populations. You know, rugby, real simple. We know when the games are. We know when we're going to need to compete. We know when the athletes are available to us. It's really kind of quite simple. In fact, the easiest sport in the world to probably strength coach is going to be your strength sports like weightlifting and powerlifting and things like that. Gets a little harder for team sports, but like American football, really easy. You know, it's every Saturday or Sunday, basically. So it's a macro management strategy. So macro management of the training process. Now, where I think people get stuck is they think periodization is just strength training. It's not. It's a holistic thing. We have to think about the psychological development of the athlete or the tactical population. We put in different psychological skills that we want to develop over time, such as relaxation techniques, focus techniques, but it's also nutrition as well. There are certain phases of a training process where we want to manipulate nutrition to either prepare for something like losing weight or gain weight or deal with higher stress. So if we have higher stress, more calories are necessary. So it's not only strength training, it's nutrition, it's psychology, and recovery. We're starting to look at this a lot. My former doctoral student, Barry Horgan, looked at this idea of different strategies of recovery at different times throughout the year for athletes. So there might be periods where you withhold recovery strategies because you want to push an adaptation. But there are other times when we actually need it. And then more recently, we're starting to look at monitoring and how that is related to the periodization process. That's the holistic kind of approach to thinking about it. So it's kind of a plan that we're trying to get from A to B. We know when things are. Where it gets difficult with the tactical population is the plan isn't always the plan, in the sense that we don't know when we need to be ready, and it becomes a little bit different model. But to be honest, when we look at UFC and MMA, they have a similar problem because they don't know when they're going to actually have an engagement until they have an engagement. And you can still have a plan.
So Greg, if in a military example, the military context, if people are training for an arduous course, when they do know when that course is going to be, they could say 12 months out, I'm going to sign up for this particular course or assessment or something like that. Is the process then, when the outcome is very predictable, is it very similar to what you would do if you were saying you were preparing someone for the Olympics? Maybe it's a 1-year cycle rather than a 4-year cycle.
Yeah, it is actually, because we actually looked at selection course to see what the physiological response to the selection course is. We wanted to see what are the things that are necessary to get through from a physical perspective. Obviously, the true differentiator is the psychological ability to be resilient. There's people that get through that you would never guess that would get through that do. So yes, we could get to that. There's certain things we know we need to be able to do. We need load carriage. If we're not strong enough to do the load carriage, we're going to fall apart. We have to have some sort of conditioning to do things for time and over again. Loaded pack marching. Those are skills you can only get by doing. And so we can design an intervention that actually prepares for the requirements to increase the chances of success.
Can we just dive into the psych side?
Yeah.
I'm a psychologist, so that when you said it can include psychology as well, that pricked my ears up. I studied periodization a long time ago now, so I'm a bit rusty. But I remember the concepts of the different cycles, the different durations of these cycles, but also you adapt things by increasing frequency, volume. These are the variables you can change. When we're looking at psychological preparation, in your experience, how do we do that side of things? How do you change the volume or intensity of, say, imagery training or goal setting? And the reason I ask is that periodization in psych is a hot topic and no one's really been able to get at it. And I think it's because most psychologists don't understand periodization properly. JP, you may be shocked to hear that.
I would argue that a lot of people don't understand periodization at the moment. So from a psychology perspective, I think we have to zoom out from it and look at periodization holistically again. It's not just sets, reps, volume, intensity. There was a wonderful paper that was written by Inigo Mujica and several colleagues from around the world that really talk about how you can align nutrition, recovery, motor learning, and psychology with the periodization models. So what it is sequencing skill sets to prepare for a certain engagement. So during certain times of the year, you're working on team dynamics. Sometimes you're working on self-efficacy. Sometimes you're working on stress reduction techniques and building this adaptable kind of model across time. Now, I would love to do some research in the space of psychology and periodization, because the more I worked in the tactical population, the psychology side of thing is the most important, it seems, that ability to be resilient.
Can we just repeat that, Greg? The psychology is the most important. JP, can we write that down?
Get back in your box.
It's definitely one of the most important factors, because you have to have the ability to overcome. And how do you overcome? They often talk about hope. Having a lot of hope is a factor that can help you overcome, or micro goal setting. So that can fall into that psychology space. So I think you can align those developments with different phases of training. So for example, if I'm in a base building period, and we can use general preparation as a global term, there's a different strategy psychology-wise to doing volume than doing load. So like, for example, one strategy I use in my own training is I always count backwards. I never count forward. Because for me, psychologically, when I count backwards, it's like I'm getting less, not getting more. And so I use those kind of tricks with myself, but we could develop those strategies based on the individual. So I think periodization is the overbridge. What we're now talking about is the programming or the micromanagement of that individual's needs.
I love that. I'm going to try that little trick myself, counting backwards. That's good.
You've got to find the gym first, mate.
I do. Yeah.
Greg, so periodization as a concept is quite interesting when you chat to people, because a lot of people seem to be under the impression that it's a contemporary idea, a contemporary concept. However, there's quite a bit of history behind this idea of periodization, and indeed many very famous individuals in human history have referred to this concept.
Yes.
So can you just give us an insight into how periodization has evolved as a conceptual model? And from a physiological standpoint, what are the sort of fundamental principles which underpin it?
I think we could probably have an entire podcast on the history of periodization because it has such a rich history. And this is something that just infuriates me at the moment. I have so many people that come up to me and they're like, oh, it started with the Russians in the 1960s. And Medvedev is the father of periodization. And yeah, that's his title, and I'm not going to take it away from him. People call him that. But the reality is we can trace it all the way back to the ancient Greeks and the tetrad preparing for military conflict. And in fact, periodization's nexus started in tactical. And that's what is so fascinating to me. Why is it that we've erased all the history from the ancient Greeks to the Russians? And it's such an interesting construct to me. And there's so many little steps where it's been modified. So the Greeks used it to prepare for war because their war style was a little bit different. It was like, we know when war is going to be, we're going to train for it, we're going to go have war. And then they adapted it for the early Olympiad. They modified it for their athletes. And then over time, people changed things. They made notations about medical benefits of training and all those things. And then one of the seminal texts is by Kotov in 1916. It's Olympic Sport is the name of the book. And that text, he talks about a lot of things that are contemporary now. So one of the hot topics right now in strength and conditioning is auto-regulation of training. He talks about it in 1916 that you cannot auto-regulate training with novice athletes because they cannot grade or modulate their training effectively because they don't know how to do it. And then you have Sikala from Finland in the 1930s breaking training into phases and periods based on the seasons. Because in Finland, you know, the weather can get quite cold and snowy. So there's different times for that. Obviously, the Germans did a whole lot in the 1930s to try to get good for the Berlin Games, and they dove deep into periodization. And in fact, there's two schools of thought, the German and the actual Russian theories of periodization. And then really in the 50s, there was a lot of people working on it at the same time. Communism was all about, so the information probably flowed through those countries, but there was a lot of people looking at these constructs and trying to solve these problems. So when we start to think about it, it's got a rich history. And to be honest, there was a time point in 1993 where it all went sideways. Everybody pretty much had some cohesiveness in terminology. And then somebody came up with this term, nonlinear periodization and linear periodization. And from that moment on, we've gotten into this reverse linear, linear, flexible, nonlinear, and all these things that really have confused the hell out of people because they're programming strategies. It's not periodization. And that's caused some real problems for the younger generation of strength coaches.
We've thrown out a few different terms that I'm confused.
Okay.
Let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
So for people listening who've never heard of this, can we just go back to basics? What is periodization? You mentioned cycles, you mentioned auto-regulation. What are we actually talking about?
So periodization is how we're going to organize training. If we just go with that as a base construct, so over time, how are we going to organize training to accomplish some goal that we're establishing? We could call it an operational plan if we really wanted to, right? We know we have to do this. So how are we going to prepare to do this? Programming is actually the implementation of the modes and methods to accomplish the goal. So when we auto-regulate training, that means the athlete, the tactical population individual, is going to change the training stimulus based on some either rating of effort or exertion or some sort of objective measure, readiness to train measure, or something like that. So auto-regulation is modifying the plan to get to where we want to be so we can adjust the training, basically. When we start to talk about linear, nonlinear periodization, linear periodization is this idea that you're just going to linearly increase training stress, which is antithetical to what periodization is, because one of the goals of periodization is to remove the linearity of training so that you can actually have periods of stress and periods of recovery. Because as we all know, you can't go at top speed forever, like Vmax. You can't sleep 2 hours a night indefinitely. It's really hard to do because the body needs to recover. We can't go without food forever. You need food. You need periods to dial back and recover, not only physiologically, but psychologically as well, as you would know. So the idea is that we're going to modify training stress to actually accomplish these goals that we're establishing for us. So what we do is in sport, we benchmark. So we have certain tests that we do and we track people. And the UK Defence Forces are doing some really interesting things with vertical jump testing and mid-thigh pull testing, maximal strength testing, basically. And they have benchmarks, and then you adjust the programs to make sure people are in the right bands over time. Those are programming strategies, but we have to know what that individual needs to do their work requirement. One of the best studies ever done was done by Mike Stone and Bill Kramer in concert with Everett Harmon, where they were trying to get female soldiers strength level comparable to males. And it was done in the early 1990s. And what they found is they could get women's strength levels up to a level where they could do most military jobs. But it took a lot of effort and a lot of dedicated focus and dedication from the individuals participating. So we can adjust the modes and methods to get people where they need to be for their operational constraints. So when I look at nonlinear, the idea is just training different ends of the spectrum, like varying training. But really, all training should be nonlinear. I always use the analogy with my students. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Push a little bit, pull back, recover. Push a little bit, pull back, recover. And that's how we can think of it from a simplistic perspective.
So, Greg, just expanding upon that.
Yeah.
So there's fundamental principles which underpin periodization. Could you just take us through them?
Yep.
Because then that should stitch this all together nicely.
Yeah. So a lot of people really think about periodization in response to physiological responses. So we have a stress response. And so that stress response can be physiological, response to physical training, psychological events, emotional events, all kinds of things. The classic theory is the general adaptive syndrome. And so with the general adaptive syndrome, basically, I go do something physically, let's say. I get fatigued. Okay. We would all agree that the harder the workload, the more fatigued we get. There's a time where I'm going to recover. And the bigger the training stimulus, the longer the time before I recover. Pretty self-explanatory. And during the recovery, the body goes through physiological adaptations to handle that stress. And now my work capacity goes up higher. If I don't organize things correctly and I just grind myself into the ground like a selection course, to me, a selection course is actually an overtraining event because it's intentional, right? I can continue to decline in performance capacity, potentially. And I could lead to what's called overtraining. In sport, we talk about that a lot. So once I get to a new level of homeostasis, my body has adapted to my training stimulus, I got to do more. So let's contextualize that. If I always go in and I always bench press 100 kilos, and I never go more than 100 kilos, I get really good at doing 100 kilos. Sometimes I got to do 105 in order to get better, right? I've got to push it harder to get better. But sometimes I got to do 90 to recover. So I got to push, pull. So with the general adaptive syndrome, we stimulate the person, they get fatigued, they recover, and we can time things out. That's the first theory that people talk about. The second one is supercompensation theory. To be honest, it's the same thing. Basically, fatigue from a training stimulus, supercompensation if we manage training correctly. And when we apply it to periodization, all people are suggesting is I've got phases where I have a lot of work. I expect performance to go down. I have periods of time where I have less work, higher intensity, so that performance can go up, or what we call preparedness. The theory that I like is the fitness fatigue paradigm. Basically, you have 2 competing factors at all times, fitness and fatigue. The more you train, the more fitness you make. But the more you train, the more fatigued you get. So fatigue masks your fitness gain. But the beauty is fatigue will dissipate at a 2/3 rate faster than fitness. So if I organize my training correctly, I manage fatigue and elevate fitness. Thus, my performance goes up. And so those 3 factors basically are central to what we're talking about with organizing training, because we know certain things are going to counteract other things. So for example, if I'm doing CQB under load all day long, right? Pretty fatiguing. We're under load. We're doing high intensity movements and high cognitive load as well, because we have to make decisions. So because that's highly fatiguing under load, then I can reduce training with load to other things to induce recovery. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And then I can do load in the weight room at other times. So what we're looking at here is this idea of modulating the training stress around the holistic construct. In sport, it's simple. Sport is a no-brainer to me. We manage everything. I mean, these professional athletes, we give them special food, they get massages, they get all the wonderful things. They're not out in the bush for 7 days carrying a 50-kilo pack. They're not doing that. So it gets a little bit different in the tactical population because we have to change the modes and methods of training around the other things they do under load.
Here's one for you, Greg. It may be a challenging question.
All right.
Some of the people that I've worked with are in that tactical field. Their job is unpredictable, like you say, load carriage, restricting food, the unpredictability of what's going to happen. But then they'll also say, yeah, but I'm a triathlete as well. And I want to be a really good triathlete because I do that at the weekend. Or I'm really into grappling and I'm entering a competition at the weekend. Can you apply periodization to help an individual who wants to be an athlete at the weekend, but then also has an occupation that is also physically demanding? Where do you sit on that?
I think you can apply periodization to anything, to be honest. I think what we have to get down to is figuring out what this person needs to do, when they need to do it, and how we're going to manage the various training stimuli. I train weightlifters who are defense personnel that compete in weightlifting, and they still have their operational jobs. And so it gets tricky because I have to design their programs in different ways because I have to account for the physical requirements of their job, yet the physical requirements of their weightlifting. And so we have to learn how to do more with less because we're really managing overall fatigue. And so the interesting part with that is around the training that we do. And what I mean by that, it is easier for me to take someone very strong and get them very fit than it is to take a very fit person and make them very strong. So what I'm finding is that for tactical populations, if I can get them really strong, that bulletproofs them, and then I can make them fit. However, if I have people who come in from a triathlon background, endurance background, they often lack the requisite strength to do the work capacity of their job. So that becomes a little bit challenging.
So, Greg, there's been certain individuals over the past decade who have took a pop at the idea of periodization, essentially poo-pooed it for clickbait more than anything else, I would argue. But with that in mind, what are the risks of not applying the concept of periodization to our training?
I would suggest that the biggest risk is random things gives random results. And we have the risk of mismanaging loads, which then increases the risk of injury, which decreases potential for operational readiness. So we need to have some sort of structure to manage training stress. And so if we think of it from a perspective of managing training stress, I think we can develop a model of periodization that fits the tactical environment and is flexible enough to account for the demands of unknowingness.
It sits in nice with the 7 Ps. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Mm-hmm. Prior preparation and planning prevents piss poor performance.
Absolutely.
And obviously it's an analogy used frequently in military populations, and training's no different. Mm-hmm. So how can we apply periodization to a tactical population? What model is going to be most appropriate? What's the sort of evidence base behind it? And what might be the limitations that we need to think about?
Okay, so let's talk about our models. I've recently, and I'm probably getting a lot of flack from it around the world because I got tired of all the terms. So I decided I was just going to dial everything down to 3 base models. So we've got parallel models where we're training everything with an equal emphasis. So you're going to train everything. You're going to do your endurance training, your strength training, your anaerobic training, your power training. All the stuff is being trained with a similar emphasis. You have the block periodization model, which I'm calling sequential because you're building things in sequence. And then I have what we would call the emphasis model. In the classic literature, it's called the pendulum model. And the pendulum model is a hybrid of parallel and sequential. Well, let's go back to my CQB example. So let's say I'm post-selection course, I'm going through CQB training. During CQB training, I would argue you need less strength training because you're under load, you're doing strength training all day long. You need more recovery training and other activities. So we can say, yes, they'll do some strength training, but we're going to reduce it down to a minimal contribution to the training program. But we're going to move something else up. It might be the aerobic training. It might be recovery interventions. It may be mobility training. It may be other factors. And the reality is, when we look at the models, the classic models tend to be more on the parallel, training everything. And what happens is, to get better, you got to keep increasing load or time commitment to the activities. And then you get to a threshold of adaptation where you just can't adapt and you overtrain. And so what do people do? They take PEDs to raise that capacity, and that's a problem. The sequential model was designed to kind of deal with that. So you would saturate the system with one or two major training factors and then move to the next one in a sequential order. A great example would be a block of hypertrophy, a block of strength, a block of power. It's the most classic example in strength training. The problem is, as you get to the power, what happens to hypertrophy? You start to lose it because you're not getting enough stimulus to maintain it. So you have residuals where you lose the adaptations. Well, that's problematic because if I'm in a population that doesn't know when their competition is, that can be detrimental to me. So the emphasis model means that we're going to create a panel of what we think that individual needs. Dr. Duncan French and I have worked on this for UFC. We actually whiteboarded what is a UFC fighter. And we actually put all these things up on a board and said, all right, how do we train all these things? And then we came up with an emphasis model for UFC and when you would do certain grappling things versus other things leading into fight camp. And so we could do the same thing in the tactical population. Let's say we're going to use a special operations person. What is a special operations person? What capacities do they need? I would argue strength is probably one of the most important factors. Some sort of endurance capacity is important. Mobility, especially at the ankle and thoracic. Those are two areas that are critical for operational capacity. I would also argue we need to have some plyometric or power base to be able to jump over things and move quickly. So agility, sprint agility. So if you think about it, those are all characteristics that we can develop interventions for. They don't have to be extensive interventions where you're in there for 3 hours a day. It could be microdosed, almost like a snack, where we just come in and do a little bit and we spread it out over multiple days instead of doing it all in a 3-hour session. You could do multiple little 15-minute sessions across the week or throughout the day, and we can develop these capacities. Now, we could say, all right, I'm doing a lot of loaded pack work right now. Okay, reduce strength training, and we can move it back and forth. So people are like, is that really periodization? Yeah, it is periodization, but I'm manipulating the programming, the targeted things that I'm going to do. I just need to know where I'm trying to get to. We know what we need to do. We know what we need to get to.
One of the popular activities at the moment is high rocks. It used to be CrossFit. There's lots of the guys do that sort of stuff. I'm not a CrossFitter, so you'd never guess from looking at me, but I'm genuinely not a CrossFitter. Shut up, JP. I just wonder, like, if you've got someone who's doing that sort of load, which CrossFit seems to be, it's sold because it's doing all these different things at once. If then you've got occupational specific training on top of that, that feels like a recipe for disaster based on what you've just said.
I think it's a recipe for disaster if we don't think about how things integrate with each other. I don't consider it just a CrossFit problem. I think even triathlon training can be a recipe for disaster if the volumes are too high and they're not integrated with what they have to do for their job. And so I think you have to kind of look at the bigger picture. There is good and bad CrossFit. Okay. If you talked to me 15, 20 years ago, I would have been really like, CrossFit bad. But after spending a bit of time in the tactical space, there's some things about CrossFit that are actually quite beneficial, but there are some things that are very negative. So for example, having absolute loads, yes, in the Defense Force, we have absolute loads that we have to carry. But from a training perspective, if we can make loads relative to people's capacities, we make them safer from a training perspective. And we can grade them to get them stronger towards the targets. You can use emphasis modeling in CrossFit, meaning you're going to touch certain elements more frequently in a block of training. But the base paradigm is actually quite interesting to me. And it would be similar to what I would do in a tactical population. Strength is always done first, then maybe some sort of high intensity anaerobic interval kind of work, and then always ending with cardio. Cardio is always the last thing that you're going to do because the strength underpins everything. And so that actually isn't incorrect. It's the recipe that sometimes isn't always good. How you're putting things together, like what are the areas that we commonly see in tactical populations for injuries? Lower backs are always a problem from the load carriage. So why would we couple rowing and deadlifting together? Two low back stressors. You have to kind of think about how things pair. So a smart PTI can take principles of CrossFit and apply them based on that individual's needs. Now, people love CrossFit. It does have a kind of a military ethos to it. It is challenging. I actually do a version of CrossFit myself in my own training now, and it has great benefit. But I think we have to be smart about how we plan it and how we structure things. High Rocks is a little bit different because it is less on the strength side and more on the endurance side. It's almost going back to the original CrossFit in a lot of ways. And that has benefit, but what we do know about modern tactical populations is load carriage is at an all-time high and it's not getting any lighter. So that is an issue that is always going to be a problem, I think, which is really funny, though. If you read the ancient Greek work, we're starting to approach what they carried.
Yeah, those shields were heavy.
Yeah, they wore metal and they wore shields and they carried those big lances. I didn't realize it until I found a historical paper on it, how much load they actually carried as well.
It's quite interesting, the whole extreme conditioning programs, just to sort of encapsulate CrossFit and High Rocks into one. That we've had quite a lot of discussions within the PT branches over here in the UK about the use of these training modalities.
Yeah.
And the problem is it's a pendulum. People were either one extreme or the other, and they were never getting the balance in the middle.
Yep.
And we sort of came to the conclusion, and there's sort of a consensus more than anything else. The guys and girls want to do it, so let's utilise it. But let's utilise it judiciously. Not as a main driver, but maybe have it as a standalone session. But the objective of that session may not necessarily be a physiological capacity. It may be stress inoculation training, tying into the psych, feeding them, driving competition, camaraderie, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or chucking a finisher at the end of a structured session. Then you say, right, we've got 10 minutes. You want to get hot and sweaty? You fancy blowing? Let's go for it. But all you're doing then is microdosing. Little microdoses to feed the beast, keep it happy. And every once in a while you have a slightly larger session, but it's part of a periodized plan and you have it in there at the right time. And for example, you wouldn't have a 12-mile loaded march with 45 kilos one day, then the next day a couple of wads, then the next day the same again, because you're just going to break people. And it's common sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think to add to that, when Mark Stevenson came up with tactical strength and conditioning in the US for NSCA, he wanted to just do it better. And so I always tell people when I think about CrossFit now, CrossFit is all the training modalities I as a strength coach might use, but it's not the recipe I might use because I have to individualize that recipe to their needs. For example, I like EMOMs. I think EMOMs are great. And EMOMs have been around since the 1950s. And we can use them effectively to do these things that you're talking about and create work capacity, get people as strong as they can and have a real high work capacity so they can do things over and over and over again in a high clip when necessary. So I agree with you. I think there's some great things that come from CrossFit. There's been some bad things as well, as with all training modalities. I learned CrossFit mainly because I started to work in the tactical population. And how can I, as a sports scientist, say I know what it is if I haven't done it? So I made sure I did it so I could have that conversation with them. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, for sure.
It sounds to me it's just an issue of communication. What I'm thinking is if people going out on a Wednesday night to their CrossFit gym, then on the Thursday morning, they just need to say to their PTI, this is what I've been doing and this is how it fits within this broader periodized process so that the Thursday session is not replicating exactly what they've just done on Wednesday night so that they're able to fit in those periods of rest and recovery. Is that accurate?
I think so. I think communication is a big part of it. So like I have had some weightlifters, like I said, that are also into defense forces. And I would always sit with one of them and I'd say, all right, what is your PT got you doing every day? What are your required PT activities? Where are your loaded pack marches? And then I would sit back as her private coach and say, all right, how am I going to integrate what she's going to be doing with them? Because that's her job. And how am I going to manipulate my training factors? And she was a lot healthier with me than she was with some other weightlifting coaches that were like, yeah, we're going all Bulgarian max out every session because it's about load management. And so to me, periodization, to get back to your question previously, what is periodization? It's a way of structuring training to load manage over time to get to a goal. And so we have different programming strategies to accomplish goals. Like, let's say I have leg strength is what I want to build, right? And I know leg strength relates to load carriage. A lot of people don't realize that. We've got data that lower body strength relates to CQB performance as well. So when we look at that, right, how can I build leg strength? Well, squatting is great. It's the number one exercise. You want to squat to build leg strength. Well, what if I have a back problem? Squatting not always great. I can hex bar deadlift and build leg strength and still be functional. I can do belt squats and build leg strength. And so what I can do is manipulate programming factors based on need. Ashley Jones, who's a famous strength coach in Australia from rugby, he often does that with his very elite athletes. He'll say, all right, I want you to work legs. You get to pick the exercise. I just need you to load it in this way. So that's where you can get that auto-regulation from selecting of the exercises. And that gives the individual some autonomy. People like autonomy. Younger people probably shouldn't get autonomy because they don't know how to choose. More experienced people do. Does that make sense from a perspective of we have that ability to have that flexibility? So I would agree with you. Communication is key, but also thinking about everything you're doing as either adding stress or removing stress, right? So if I'm sleep deprived, add stress. If I don't eat enough, add stress. If I'm doing high rocks on the weekends and at nights, and I still have PT, adding stress. So the more stress I add, the eventual point is I'm going to get to a break point. And I'm either going to get hurt or I'm going to burn out. And so I think when we think about periodization, it's just simply managing that process.
Excellent.
And I think it very much needs to be a two-way process as well. Obviously, for the individual, if they know on the Thursday they've got, let's say, in the military unit, command-led PT, and it's going to be an arduous bit of training, and right, I've got high rocks here on Wednesday night, right, maybe I'll give the high rocks a miss before I do the PT on the Wednesday.
Yep.
But then conversely, for the strength coach, the PTI, and we used to do it, you get the group, how's everyone feeling this morning? And you would see what the response was in terms of the energy from the group. And if the energy was low, right, we might check fire on what we're going to do. And we're going to do some active recovery or something totally different because this just ain't going to work out well.
Yep.
Conversely, how are you feeling today? We're buzzing staff, we're good to go. Mega. Trains coming. But it needs to be both ways, that's for sure. Greg, I'm just going to steer the conversation a slightly different way to talk about a paper which you co-published last year with Andrew Uphill titled The Physiological Consequences of Recovery Following the Australian SF Selection Course. It was a brilliant paper. I really enjoyed reading it. But can you tell us more about this particular project? Why was it commissioned and what were your sort of findings?
I think we got involved because we wanted to see the physiological impact of selection course. And the last time that any work in this space in Australia had been done was almost a quarter of a century ago. So there wasn't much on the modern techniques of not only the preparation of the soldiers in the selection course, but also the physiological quantification. We actually did a series of papers. There's one where we actually looked at smartwatches and put metabolic carts on squads to look at the metabolic cost of a 25-minute close quarter scenario with live fire. And we did that because we were trying to find a device to measure how many calories are expended during selection because we wanted to put a device on and we thought, they all have Garmin, so let's use the Garmin. Stuff didn't work so good. It was just not reliable or accurate enough. Apple Watch is spectacular for heart rate, but it runs out of battery like as quick as can be. And so we decided to pivot. And when we did the full study, we actually used doubly labeled water to actually measure metabolism. And so the idea was that we would quantify the physiological stress of the selection course. And we did it by phase. And then what we were going to do is look at the return from selection, how they responded. And we had benchmarks across time, set time periods after selection course, all the way out to a year. So the idea was that this would give us an idea how to enhance the post-selection course PTI programming so that we could improve the quality of the reboot of the soldiers from selection. That's the nexus of the study. Angela did a phenomenal job on it. It was a group project. We worked very hard on this one. To me, it's probably my most favorite project and the project that I'm most proud of. That project actually has done a lot of good for defense preparation in Australia and I think around the world from the feedback that we've been getting.
So what was the impact? What was the specific physiological impact? What were you seeing in terms of energy expenditure, how that was impacting upon physiological performance? What sort of metrics were you looking at?
So we looked at caloric expenditure. So we were seeing about 8,000 calories a day of caloric expenditure.
8,000?
Yes.
It's high.
It's very high. I often joke with my friends in the sports space that this was an overtraining study. Because, selection courses, what are germane to selection courses? Sleep deprivation, food restriction, high physical work capacity, high stress, right? All the wonderful things that cause overtraining. And the challenge is you don't know who's going to make it through selection course. So you've got to dose almost everybody. And then you hope that you get enough at the end of selection course that have actually been on the doubly labeled water. Not everybody volunteers. So we lucked out. We got a fair few through, enough to have a study. And we measured blood. So we looked at stress hormones, hormones that are common to overtraining, anabolic and catabolic hormones. So testosterone, cortisol, growth hormone, IGF-1, things like that. And what we did is we measured body weight. So we could see that obviously if you're on an 8,000 calorie a day and you're only consuming 2,000 calories or less, what's going to happen to body weight? It goes down quite extensively. And every selection course in the world knows that. So that wasn't the most novel finding. But what we did find, which was interesting, is that we also measured markers that are traditionally measurements of strength, power, and things of that nature. So before selection course, we did mid-thigh pull testing for maximal strength. We did vertical jump testing for maximal power, and we repeated it after. And then we did it at time points in the reboot as well. And we measured blood during the time points of reboot. The other thing that we did that was really creative is we actually measured metabolism. There was some speculation amongst the military that potentially metabolism changes from special forces selection. I didn't buy that at all, because I thought the preliminary data that they were looking at that the Australian Institute of Sport collected was questionable at best. So we had metabolic rate. We actually did, the whole full resting metabolic rate with the metabolic carts and the hoods and all that stuff in the dark in the morning. It was quite an endeavor. So we had that as well. And then we also had DEXA for body composition. So we could look at fat mass loss and lean mass maintenance or loss. And what we found was really quite expected and unexpected at the same time. We expected to see weight loss because I don't think there's a single study for a special forces selection course where people don't lose weight. We expected to see fat mass loss. Obviously, one of the historical things that people suggest before you go to selection course is get fat so you have more weight to lose, which is actually a bad recommendation because you have more non-functional mass to move. So then you have to work harder, get stronger and leaner before you go, and you're actually going to be better off. And this study kind of shows that if you look at the data. And what we found was quite interesting, that you are very catabolic at the back end. Testosterone is suppressed almost to levels of hypogonadism. So you're really low on your testosterone, but it does come back, and it comes back in a quite rapid way. Some things are slower, some things are faster, but within 2 weeks, some things are starting to come back if you do the right things. Eat correctly, do the right interventions and things of that nature. The issue becomes that in a selection course post-period, you start to do other courses. And so you're recovering, and then all of a sudden, then you're not recovering. And then you're recovering, and then you're not recovering. So that paper can inform the sequencing of some of the courses that are following selection and which ones are put where. The most interesting finding for me was that relative strength was maintained pre-post, which shocked me. Because any study I look at, they only report absolute strength, and absolute strength goes down. But think of it this way. I lose weight. Of course, absolute strength is going to go down. To the tissue, relative strength stays, and those that make it through about the same.
So if we've got someone listening who's considering going on some kind of selection course like that, would you say increase your relative strength? Is that something that is a priority for this training phase before they go onto the course?
Lower body strength, lower body relative strength needs to get up. It seems to be that relative strength on the isometric mid-thigh pull, so an isometric test, legs are slightly bent, pulling against an immovable object on force plates, basically giant bathroom scales, needs to be somewhere around 38 to 40 kilograms per newton, minimum. And if you have that, then you have the requisite relative strength. That's my opinion based on the research that Angela's done. You have the strength levels necessary. Now, there are a lot of ways to build strength, but you need to have that relative strength as high as possible. And I do not think the strategy of getting as fat as possible beforehand is a good plan. You want to be fit to handle the work that you need to do. Obviously, I do think in a preparation, having those events where you challenge someone's resiliency are necessary to be planned into that preparation so that they build the capacity to overcome feeling uncomfortable. because they're going to be uncomfortable for the length of the selection course. So the only way to build low carriage capacity is to load carry and increase lower body relative strength. Those are critical.
There you go. So I'm just going to bring this on and stitch it in. We started talking about periodization.
Yep.
Obviously, we've talked about an arduous selection course and the physiological impact of it. How would you recommend using periodization to prepare for such an arduous course?
Well, I think that's a great question because I don't know of any studies that have actually done it. It would be an awesome study to do, but it's a risky study to do because if you get it wrong, somebody gets unselected, and that's a problem. Theoretically, what I would suggest is we probably have to use a model where we're trying to increase work capacity across a time frame leading into the selection course. We'd have to have periods where we get strength as high as possible, and then periods of time where we dedicate to the ability to express high forces repetitively. And then obviously we have to have conditioning, right? Because there is always a distance run in every military selection course around the world. Endurance is a key capacity. So we have to balance the demands of strength development and fitness development. And that becomes tricky. Let's just use a general analogy. The world's strongest man does not look like the best marathon runner. They have very different physiological structures. So doing marathon running and trying to be as strong as possible, you're not going to get it to maximal super high levels of strength. So we have to kind of think about this from a balancing of training stress. So I think there are going to be segments of time where we have to dedicate to getting strong, segments of time where we're going to take and use that strength and endurance factors, always having some endurance element. And I think based on the USARM work, you should have 1 day a week of load carriage, pack marching in your developmental process. Leading on bringing the work capacity up right before selection, but then having a period where you recover them leading into selection so they're fresh in order to do that. We have to also think about how we're going to manage potential pre-existing injuries. 2 areas that are common are ankles and backs. So we've got to make sure we try to do some injury prevention work around that as well. I would suggest mobility is probably one of the most important factors for everyone. And everyone should have a structured mobility or flexibility program for every single day of the week, even on days off. Because one of the things that we see as you age, mobility goes away. You can't build strength on poor range of motion. So I think that's the center of our training structure, is having range of motion. And so for me, periodization would be looking at my individual person, where are their weaknesses and strengths, and trying to get them to some level of preparedness for selection, but also folding in challenges that are going to challenge their resilience into the program at key times so that they're put under stress, because they are going to be under stress. And that's how I would look at it.
Nice.
Awesome. Greg, you're a busy man and we've been talking for a long time, and I really appreciate the detail that you've got into. What I'd like to do to wrap the episode up is to hand it over to you to introduce something that you really want to talk about that you maybe haven't talked about yet, or reiterate a key point. So over to you. How would you like to close up?
Well, I think for me, the first thing I always do when I'm working with tactical populations is thank them. Thank them for what they do and how they serve for us, the people that aren't in those populations. They're the most important people in my mind. And being from a family that has served, it really gives me connection. I think we can do better preparing the tactical population with smarter training, smarter interventions, and finding ways to use periodization and strategies, not by pulling them and plugging them from sport. I think that's a really big mistake. We've got to think of the tactical population as its own entity and draw on the knowledge that we have from sport and adapt that knowledge so that we can make that tactical population as resilient, lethal, and survivable as possible. And that's the framework that I work from. We've got to make them so that they can do their job and come home. And so what we need to do is think about periodization as a framework to help achieve the goal of making the best tactical person we can. And there has to be a degree of individualization in that. And I think that's often lost in tactical populations because it's big groups of people and it's hard to individualize. And I think with technology that we can probably get to a point where we can make things a little bit more dialed in. But that doesn't mean it always has to be dialed in, because if we're in an environment where we're not dialed in, we're having to do things that are not in our strength, we still have to do it. So we have to be uncomfortable and we have to build in challenges. I think it's about smart training decisions, understanding that we can't go at full max all the time, and managing workload, basically. And I think that can be a multitude of things. And I think the psychological stress, which I have to go back to because I left you hanging, with Hans Selye's general adaptive syndrome, the rate of recovery is actually impacted by psycho-emotional stress. So if someone's under high psycho-emotional stress, their sense of fatigue is greater. Their time course of recovery is greater. So we have to address that when we're designing our interventions. So we have to understand that person, not just physically, but psycho-emotionally as well. And I think that is important as well, because you can get very good and very successful with less. You don't have to do everything all the time. In fact, sometimes less is more. And when someone has a high training age, they don't need as much training stimulus to maintain. So again, balancing the needs and integrating multiple factors into the whole holistic individual.
Great way to wrap it up. Thanks a lot, Greg. If anyone wants to follow you, see what you're up to, is there ways of people doing that?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, on Instagram, or my email address here at ECU.
Great stuff. We'll get some of those links into the show notes. Greg, again, massive thank you from me.
Yeah.
It's been a masterclass. Thanks for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
Great session, mate. Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in. And if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.